The GoPro 12 is here and it's time to see what this camera is capable of. So just a quick disclaimer before I start this video. GoPro did send me the Hero 12 out to review early for this video, but DJI did the same for their Action 4. And I do have affiliations with both of these companies. I have worked with DJI in the past on launch videos, and I'm also a recipient of the GoPro $1 Million Challenge. So take with that information what you will. I'm gonna make this review as unbiased as possible, and it's up to you whether you decide I am being honest or not. So the GoPro 12 has a really similar design to the GoPro 11. It's got this new speckled blue look around some of the finishes, which I actually think looks really cool. And then on top of that, it's also got a tripod screw at the bottom now between the folding fingers. And this is a really nice little touch to add in there because it makes mounting it to little tripods or other base plates a lot simpler. However, I do still give the win of build quality and design to DJI for the Action 4, just because it's a little bit smaller overall, and also these doors are a lot easier to open and it just feels like a bit more solid of a product. But in saying that, both of these cameras are really solidly built and I don't think you're gonna have a problem with durability with either of them. To test out the overheating, I put the 11, the 12 and the Action 4 head to head outside in the evening where it was about 16 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And all cameras were identical settings at 4K 60p with stabilization on, and all the screens were set to turn off after 1 minute. And the results were quite interesting. The GoPro 11 lasted 30 minutes before shutting down, and the GoPro 12 lasted 48 minutes before shutting down, while the Action 4 lasted a total of 80 minutes. Now, clearly the Action 4 was the winner in this category, but it is good to see that the GoPro 12 has definitely improved on the thermal performance over the GoPro 11. Now, I just want to mention that your results may vary in this category. As you might have seen in my previous review, where I put the cameras in the sun with the screens on, the GoPro 11 actually lasted longer than the Action 4. So it's really going to depend on the scenario you're working in. But for me in this test, the Action 4 was the clear winner. So of course I had to test these cameras with their time-lapse and hyperlapse options. So I made a really cool setup using the suction cup, and I mounted them to the sunroof of a car and got this really cool frame. Now, when it comes to time-lapse options, the GoPro can do time warp or normal time-lapse. And the difference is the time warp is stabilized in video. Now, the Action 4, as far as I can see, can only do unstabilized time-lapse. And this is definitely a benefit for the GoPro because sometimes if you're doing a walking hyperlapse or something like that, it's good to have the stabilization. However, for these tests, I definitely prefer the more locked off look you get from no stabilization applied. Now, looking at other settings, the GoPro 12 can actually do up to 8:7 aspect ratio for time lapses now, which is really cool for being able to choose vertical or horizontal videos in post. Now, if you want to go even wider, the GoPro 12 now has the Max Lens 2, which you put on, it gives you a way wider field of view, and I really like this. I think it looks great. My only gripe with it is I could only find time warp options for it, and there was no time-lapse option with no stabilization applied, which I really don't understand. So for me, the GoPro 12 does win the time-lapse category just because it has more options, it has more versatility when it comes to how you want to shoot, and I always appreciate that from a camera manufacturer. It's very important, you always gotta roll around on your ball. Hey Ollie. Gotta roll around on your ball before playing. Apologies for this thing on my face. I had some stitches put in and it might be there for the rest of this video. But anyways, I love to use action cameras for point of view shots, specifically with the GoPro mount mount. So what I really want to see is if there is a difference between these two cameras with the new features that it comes with. So for me, the GoPro 11 versus the GoPro 12 are going to be pretty similar for point of view shots. You will get better dynamic range if you do use the log profile, and you can also use HDR if you want to get that HDR look with the extended dynamic range as well. So now I'm going to compare the two cameras, but with GoPro's other new product as well. And that's this Max Lens Mod 2. And the Max Lens Mod 2 is basically a wider, better optically version of the first one. And this is really exciting because it creates a super wide field of view, which should be perfect for getting point of view shots like this. And you can actually shoot in up to 4K 60 now, whereas with the previous max lens mod, it was capped at I think 2.7K. Boy! Where the GoPro 12 is going to be a lot better though is when you add the max lens mod. It's just a much wider field of view and I think it looks awesome. Being able to do this up to 4K 60p is just perfect for me and there's not more I could want from a point of view camera in that regard. So now we swapped out the GoPro 11 for the Action 4 and we're going to compare these side by side again. And we're going to do it with the Max Lens Mod 2 on the GoPro 11. So when it comes to the GoPro 12 versus the Action 4, it's basically the same story. Now when you add in the Max Lens Mod 2, you get that way bigger field of view and it's just a really perfect look for those really cool point of view shots, and I really love the GoPro for this. I think the Max Lens Mod 2.0 was a really great addition to the camera. So I'm out here at these beautiful canola fields and I've got the Avata here as well, and what I've done is mounted the GoPro 12 on top and I'm just gonna fly it around here, get some beautiful cinematic FPV footage. Then I'm gonna pop the Action 4 in here and then compare the two. And I've got the freewheel ND filters on here because I wanna get that 1/60th of a second shutter speed to see what these cameras can really do at their optimum settings. Starting with the GoPro 12, I've used the settings which I think are the best for FPV, and this is with Hypersmooth turned off, so we'll use Real Steady in post. And this is the same shot, but with Hypersmooth turned on. It does look pretty good, but I would still recommend using Real Steady in post, just because you correct for the fisheye lens and it does do a better job. And now this is with Real Steady applied and cropped to fit the screen, and of course the color grade. And you can see it looks really good. I'm very happy with these shots and you can't really go wrong with the GoPro 12 for FPV. And I've basically just done the same thing with the Action 4 here. This is with Rocksteady turned off, and then these are with Rocksteady turned on. So you can see Rocksteady also does a really good job. I would recommend flying with Rocksteady turned off and then applying gyroflow in post. And then after you crop it and you apply color grade, it's gonna look really good like this. To be honest, they both look really good when stabilized, and there's not much of a difference between the two. I realized I made a bit of a mistake with these shots I did of the FPV in the canola fields, and that's that the GoPro 12 has a new feature called GP log, which is basically a really flat color profile, which should give you the most dynamic range and the most flexibility for color grading in post. But I didn't realize you have to go into the settings and enable it to actually use it. I thought it was just being applied all the time. So to actually use the GP log, you need to go into your preferences here, scroll down to video, and then you need to change your bitrate from standard to high. And then you also need to change your bit depth from 8-bit to 10-bit. And now when we go into our settings to change our video settings, the option should be there. So you'll see now we have the option to select log. So just to explain why I'm here, I'm currently in my cabin on an expedition with one of my clients, EOS, in Norway, and it gives me a good chance to test out the dynamic range of these two cameras. So as you can see here, on the left I have the GoPro 12, and on the right I have the Action 4, and we're gonna put them side by side to see which log profile is the best. As you can see here, the GoPro 12 consistently maintained a lot more detail in the highlights instead of that blown out look that you often get with action cameras, as you can see here with the Action 4 footage. However, you do need to consider that because of the larger sensor, the Action 4 is going to perform much better in the shadows in this category. In this other scenario, you can also see the same results where the GoPro 12 maintains better dynamic range overall, but it's also a lot noisier in the shadows. If we take the cameras outside, things change and you're not going to get that noise in the GoPro, so it definitely wins in this dynamic range category, which is surprising but really good to see at the same time. And if you're serious about getting the best out of your GoPro, I've definitely enabled that log feature with the 10-bit video. Now for low light, nothing has changed with the GoPro 12 sensor, so as we all know, the Action 4 is going to pull ahead of the GoPro 12. and do much better in low light scenarios. I tested them again on a plane window, and you can see that the GoPro 12 footage is just a lot more noisy and not as pleasing as the Action 4. The Action 4 really stands out for this. Some advice I will give you is don't put the GoPro above ISO 800, because what I've found is it basically just adds more noise to the image and isn't helpful, as you can see in these tests at 6400 ISO. So it's obvious that with that much bigger sensor, the Action 4 is definitely going to be better for all low light scenarios. However, in saying that, I basically never use action cameras for low light. It's only really when I'm doing shooting at sunrise or sunset that I will notice this gain in performance, because you will get better noise performance, especially in the shadows with the Action 4. Now, HDR is a brand new feature added to the GoPro 12, and I believe it's the first time it's ever been added to a GoPro. And it is a pretty cool feature, but it's gonna be polarizing at the same time. I think you either like that HDR look or you don't, and for me personally, I don't really like the look. It is cool that it is going to give you better retention of detail in the shadows and the highlights and give you better dynamic range overall, but at the same time your resolutions and frame rates are going to be capped at 4K at 30, which is not ideal, and you might not even like how it looks anyways. But in saying that, the Action 4 doesn't even have an HDR option, so I have to give this win to the GoPro 12. I just want to mention that particularly for FPV, this is a really big feature, because when you set your exposure on the ground, obviously you can't change it in the air. So what that means is sometimes you'll come down and the sky or the sun is blown out and the rest of the image is fine and it just doesn't look great. But with the GoPro's extended dynamic range, you're gonna retain a lot more detail there, so that's a lot less likely to happen. For underwater shooting, there's no benefit mentioned in the GoPro 12 over the 11, so I'm not gonna retest these. But from my testing, the Action 4 is the better camera for this scenario, because it does maintain better white balance and color when it's underwater, as well as having a higher depth rating of 16 meters compared to 10 meters on the GoPro 12. So on paper, the GoPro advertises 5.3K, whereas the Action 4 only goes up to 4K. Now, as I've said before, I think this increase in resolution is more superficial than anything else, because when I put these cameras side to side and cropped into 800%, I literally cannot see a difference. They are equal in quality across the board. And I think this is down to the lens, because no matter how much resolution there is on the sensor, the lens can only retain so much detail. And I think it's really hard to get past 4K resolution on a lens when it's in this small little body. So across the board, I would say they're definitely a tie when it comes to resolution, and I wouldn't consider getting the GoPro over the Action 4 just because of that resolution bump. GoPro 12 finally has an updated menu, and I way prefer this layout. I found it was way more intuitive, easy to use, and I'm a big fan of that upgrade. However, in saying that, I think the Action 4 definitely does still have the superior menu system, and overall it's just a lot easier to navigate and change settings. And the GoPro does still have some weird quirks. For example, you can only change the shutter speed manually between 1/30th, 1/60th, 1/120th, and a lot of the time I want to make it somewhere between 1/60th and 1/20th, but it's impossible, and it's just really annoying. So for overall general use, I would definitely say the Action 4 is easier, and it wins the menu category. Just a quick battery update here. So the GoPro 12 is advertised as having a better battery life than the 11. And I've actually seen that here today, because both of these cameras started on 100% this morning, and the 12 is on 66% remaining, while the 11 has 48% remaining. So that's actually a pretty substantial battery life upgrade, and we always like to see that in an action camera. So in the real world test, it did definitely feel like the GoPro 12 was lasting longer than the GoPro 11, but also it felt like the Action 4 was lasting longer than the GoPro 12. So to put it in a more technical test, I decided to set them up in my apartment underneath the AC unit so none of them would overheat, and we just test the battery life. And I set them to identical settings at 4K 120p with stabilization on, and the screens to go off after 1 minute of being in idle. And the results were really interesting. The GoPro 11 lasted for only 30 minutes, while the GoPro 12 lasted for 55 minutes. But on top of that, the Action 4 lasted for a total of 70 minutes. So I can definitely say that the GoPro 12 lasts a lot longer than the 11, with an improvement of about 83% at this setting. But the Action 4 is still the king, lasting an extra 27% even over the GoPro 12 in this setting. One more thing I need to mention with this is GoPro has a really bad rep in the past with being buggy and freezing and having to pull the battery out to restart it, but I haven't experienced any of this with the GoPro 12. I really think GoPro has put a lot of effort into fixing this problem, and this isn't even with launch firmware, it's with pre-launch firmware. And I really think that's becoming a thing of the past, where both cameras are going to operate at a similar level of reliability. As for the stabilization, to be honest, I haven't seen a big difference between Hypersmooth 6.0 and 5.0, but it could just be that my use cases aren't extreme enough to see the benefits of it. In saying that, both of these cameras have excellent stabilization, and a gimbal really is not necessary anymore, and it's going to have to be a tie for me for the stabilization category. So slow motion is an interesting one for me, and I believe in my previous review I mentioned that they were basically equal in this, but I've actually changed my mind on that. And it's for a few reasons regarding resolution and aspect ratio. So if you want to shoot 240 FPS with the Action 4, you have to do it in 1080p, whereas with the GoPro 11 and 12 you can do it in up to 2.7K. And there is actually a difference in the visual quality from these two modes. So the GoPro is definitely better for that. Now on top of that, my favorite slow motion feature is 2.7K with 120 frames per second and a 4:3 aspect ratio. And this is what I used to shoot my GoPro MDC shot last year with my dog. And I really like this because it gives you that top and bottom flexibility for cropping afterwards, which is really helpful because it can often be really hard to frame a shot, especially if it's a fast moving object. And the downside of the Action 4 is to shoot 2.7K 120 FPS, you still have to do that 16:9 aspect ratio. So maybe this is something that DJI will add in the future. I personally really hope they will. But for me, the GoPro is going to win the slow motion category for those reasons. Now for the big question, is the GoPro 12 worth upgrading to? And if you're looking at upgrading from a GoPro 10 or downwards, I would say definitely. It's going to be a massive jump up, a lot of new features, and this is a really good action camera in my opinion. Now, if you're looking at the GoPro 12 versus the GoPro 11, it's a bit of a different story. They're a lot more similar, and to be honest, when I first saw these specs, I was a bit underwhelmed. But in saying that, after using the camera for a few weeks, I've actually changed my opinion. The way improved battery life, the updated menus, and the GP log with the extended dynamic range all make the GoPro 12 a really worthy upgrade over the GoPro 11. Now, if you throw in the Max Lens Mod 2 in there, you've got an even better upgrade option, and I would really consider it if those features do mean something to you. Now, the other big question, GoPro 12 versus Action 4, and GoPro has made this annoyingly difficult for me to decide on. I genuinely haven't picked a favorite yet, because when I'm looking at my camera bag and I'm deciding, do I want to bring the GoPro 12 or do I want to bring the Action 4? I don't know which to choose, and I'm bringing both of them. And the reason for that is they're better at different things. The GoPro 12 is going to be better for point of view shots, especially with that max lens mod. And on top of that, I think for FPV, when you have enough light, the GoPro is going to be a better choice because it does have that GP log with better dynamic range. However, of course, the Action 4 has a better menu system, it's got better battery life, and it's got better low light performance. So it's honestly a really tough one, and both of these cameras are excellent action cameras in my opinion. I think you're gonna have to ask me in a few months which I prefer, because I genuinely can't give you an honest answer now that I prefer one over the other. If you want to pick up either of these cameras, I put links to the latest pricing in the description below. And I really hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. And if you did, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.